My name is Avery Collins, and at a family dinner not long ago, something happened that I'm pretty sure my parents will never forget. I should have known how the night would go the moment I walked in. The energy around the table already felt lopsided, everyone leaning toward my brother, laughing a little too loud at everything he said, acting like I was just another chair in the room. And when he introduced the new woman he brought with him, the shift was instant. My parents lit up. My brother played the charming host, and suddenly, every story, every compliment, every bit of attention belonged to them. I sat there trying not to shrink into myself, and for a while I let the noise wash over me. I'm used to being background noise in my own family. But then she turned toward me with a warm smile, like she actually wanted to include me. "So what do you do?" she asked. I didn't even get one syllable out before my father cut in fast, sharp, dismissive. "Don't bring that up. We don't want to lose face." It was casual for him, like he'd said something reasonable. The others laughed lightly, trying to play off the sting he didn't mind delivering. My brother leaned back, smirked, and added, "Maybe lie this time. Sounds less pathetic." The table chuckled again. She didn't. She glanced at me, uneasy, like she saw something the rest of them had stopped noticing a long time ago. I smiled anyway. That automatic, well-trained smile I've used for years because fighting it never changed anything. And in that moment, while they laughed at a joke that wasn't a joke, I felt something slide into place inside me, quiet but solid. There are moments when a family shows you exactly where you stand without ever raising their voice. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just held that same smile until the day their faces turned pale. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who should have supported you, stay with me, because what happened next turned their confidence upside down. It took me a long time to understand that the tension in my family didn't suddenly appear one night at a dinner table. It had been accumulating quietly, almost politely, for most of my life. When I think about my childhood, nothing jumps out as a single dramatic event. No screaming fights. No slammed doors. No grand tragedies. What shaped me were quieter things, the subtle imbalances you only recognize when you're older. I was the kid who spent hours drawing characters, experimenting with colors, messing with old editing software on a laptop that overheated every 10 minutes. I loved creating things, not because anyone encouraged me, but because it was the one place I felt like I made sense. My parents, Peter and Linda Collins, didn't dislike my interests, they just never saw them as meaningful. What they valued were measurable achievements, the kind that earned applause at family gatherings, and that world belonged entirely to my brother Nolan. Nolan was the child everyone bragged about, the athlete, the straight-A student, the future leader, who just had something special. My parents treated his schedule like gravity. Everything revolved around it. They talked about him with a tone that told the world they weren't just proud, they were invested. I was optional, present, but rarely centered. The first time the hierarchy was obvious to me was at an art showcase in middle school. I had spent weeks on a digital illustration that my teacher believed had a real shot at winning an award. It was the first time I felt genuinely excited to show them something of mine. But the night of the showcase, Nolan had a scrimmage that couldn't be missed, and that was that. My parents didn't even consider splitting up to attend both. I walked through the exhibit alone, pretending I didn't care as I watched classmates pose with their families. I remember standing in front of my piece, hands shoved in my pockets, wondering if maybe I had expected too much. Then there was the day our new neighbors asked what we were interested in. Nolan talked about debate and scholarships. My mother lit up like a spotlight. When it was my turn, she smiled politely and said, "Avery is still figuring things out," as if I wasn't standing right there hearing myself be categorized as a work in progress. It wasn't said with malice, but it told me everything about how she saw me: unfinished, uncertain, less impressive. Over time, these moments layered themselves into something heavy. Nolan didn't have to be cruel. Simply being the favorite created its own kind of distance. Teachers compared us, relatives compared us. Even strangers eventually learned to say, "Oh, you're Nolan's sister." Like my entire identity existed in his shadow. When I got older and chose graphic design, I hoped maybe the clarity of a real direction would shift something for my parents. I built freelance projects, took online courses, improved faster than I expected. I showed them the first paid design I ever completed, a poster for a local nonprofit. They nodded politely and immediately asked Nolan if he'd heard back from a leadership program he applied to. It was always like that. My accomplishments were acknowledged the way you acknowledge whether a passing comment before moving on. Nolan brought home trophies. I brought home finished work. One received applause, the other received a distracted smile. By the time I moved out and started my own small design business, I had already learned to keep my expectations low. I still wanted them to see me, but I stopped waiting for it. So when Nolan introduced Ruby and the entire night pivoted around them, it didn't surprise me. What happened at the table wasn't new. It was familiar in a way that almost felt rehearsed. But hearing my father interrupt me, saying he didn't want me to make them lose face, and Nolan laughing, telling me to lie, because the truth sounded pathetic, that landed differently. Not because it was the worst thing they'd ever said to me, but because it was the clearest. Years of subtle dismissals had finally sharpened into something blunt enough that I couldn't pretend I misheard it. That dinner wasn't the cause of anything. It was simply the moment I stopped giving them excuses. The night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, colder than I expected, but it helped keep my thoughts from spiraling too fast. I got into my car without looking back at the house and started driving through Richmond's quiet streets, letting the hum of the engine drown out the echoes of the dinner table. Streetlights flicked across the windshield as I passed them, each one flashing like a reminder of something I wanted to forget. I kept telling myself to focus on the road, but my mind kept slipping to the way everyone's faces looked when they laughed at my expense, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were stiff from gripping the wheel too tightly. I went upstairs and unlocked the door, barely noticing the familiar creak it always made. The room was dark except for the faint glow from my monitor, still on sleep mode from the morning. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see the whole space. I dropped my bag onto the floor and let myself sink down on the couch, feeling the weight of the evening settle into my chest like something I couldn't shake off. My laptop sat open on the coffee table with the unfinished game project pulled up, character sketches, environmental drafts, half-coded sequences, all waiting for me to keep building the world I had imagined. But tonight, it didn't look like a world. It looked like a burden. I pulled the laptop toward me and stared at the screen until the shapes blurred into static. My fingers dragged the cursor toward the delete option again, slower this time, more deliberate. The idea of wiping everything clean flashed through me with a strange kind of comfort. If I erased it all, there would be nothing left to disappoint anyone, including myself. But my hand trembled before I could press down, and I froze. Something in me refused to let go of the only thing that felt like mine. I closed the laptop abruptly and leaned back, pressing my palms against my eyes to steady my breath. I sat like that for a while, not crying, not angry, just hollow. My phone buzzed next to me. Then again, I didn't rush to check it. Part of me already knew what I would see. When I finally picked it up, the family group chat was lit with messages. None of them asked if I got home safely. None of them mentioned anything that happened directly. They simply wrote, "Leaving early wasn't necessary," and it made things uncomfortable. And next time, be more considerate. I stared at the screen with a dull ache in my stomach. They weren't just ignoring my feelings. They were annoyed that my absence didn't fit the perfect picture they wanted to preserve. I put the phone face down and pushed it away. The room felt smaller now, like the air had thickened. I stood up and walked to my desk, switching on the monitor. The sudden light washed across the stacks of paper sketches and sticky notes that usually energized me. Tonight, they looked like evidence of trying too hard for too long. I scrolled through my inbox without focusing my eyes, catching on subject lines with client updates and newsletters I had ignored all week. Then, one name stopped me: Dr. Everett Hayes. I recognized it instantly, even though we had never spoken one-on-one. He was a senior professor known in the indie game development community, someone whose talks I had listened to online more times than I'd admit. Seeing his name attached to an email addressed to me felt impossible for a moment. I moved the cursor toward the message and hesitated, my heartbeat picking up in a way I hadn't felt all night. The room was still, the only sound the low hum of my computer. I clicked the email open, not knowing whether it would make anything better, but feeling for the first time since leaving the dinner table that something in my life had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to make me sit up straight. Opening the email felt like stepping into a different room, one where my life wasn't defined by other people's expectations. The subject line alone made my pulse jump. Regarding your game submission. I clicked it carefully, half afraid the words would rearrange themselves into something ordinary once I opened it. But they didn't. Dr. Everett Hayes introduced himself in the first line, explaining that he had been reviewing independent game submissions for the Innovation Showcase in San Francisco. He wrote that my project had stood out for its atmosphere, emotional depth, and distinct personal voice. I reread that sentence more than once just to confirm I wasn't projecting meaning onto it. Near the middle of the email, he extended an invitation to join a mentorship program. He oversaw limited slots, competitive selection, direct guidance, and a guaranteed presentation spot at the conference. It was the kind of opportunity people in my field chased for years. I sat frozen for several seconds, trying to process the shift from being dismissed at a dinner table to having my work noticed by someone whose name carried actual weight. When I finally replied, my fingers felt slightly numb, but I managed to type a coherent acceptance and schedule a call. The video call happened 2 days later, and even before he spoke, I understood why people respected him. Dr. Hayes had the kind of presence that reassured you before he even asked a question. When he welcomed me onto the call, his tone was warm, patient, like he had all the time in the world to listen. He asked about my background, what inspired the world I was creating, how long I'd been working on the mechanics. I answered honestly, stumbling here and there, still adjusting to the idea of being taken seriously. At one point, I apologized for explaining a feature too long. He smiled slightly and said, "You'd be surprised how many families don't get this field. Most creators learn early to justify the hours they spend building something invisible to everyone but them." The comment wasn't probing yet, it landed deeper than he knew. He moved on without lingering on it, and that small mercy alone made it easier to talk. He outlined how the mentorship would work: weekly calls, targeted milestones, creative exercises, and a push toward refining the emotional core of the game. It sounded demanding, but it sounded purposeful, and that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. After the call ended, he sent a folder of documents, schedule templates, submission guidelines, and a detailed PDF describing the event's sponsors and structure. I opened everything immediately, skimming through the requirements, trying to steady the excitement I felt. Then I reached the sponsor list. Logos filled the page: tech companies, hardware manufacturers, private donors, and right in the gold sponsor section, unmistakable. Even in grayscale was the emblem of Nolan's finance firm. For a moment, I just stared at it, my mind slow to catch up. Of all the conferences in the country, of all the events that could have chosen my project, it was one his company happened to fund. A strange mixture of tension and clarity settled into me. The old instinct was to imagine how my parents would twist this into something about Nolan, how they'd minimize my effort and spin the sponsorship as some kind of indirect credit to him. But then a different thought pushed in, steadier and more grounded. This wasn't about them. This wasn't tied to their approval or their version of success. This was mine, earned, recognized, and independent of any family narrative. I closed the document slowly, letting the realization settle. I didn't need to tell them anything. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need to brace myself for their reactions or their comparisons. For once, I wanted the story to unfold on my terms. I leaned back in my chair and felt something shift inside me, small but solid. One clear thought formed, quiet but absolute. I'll keep this to myself. They'll learn the truth when everyone else does. The pace of my days shifted the moment I committed to the showcase, turning my apartment into something between a studio and a battlefield. I started waking up early, not out of discipline, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. Each morning, I opened my project and dove straight into improving the demo, tightening character movement, smoothing interaction sequences, and rebuilding areas that had never felt quite right. The trailer followed, demanding hours of trimming scenes, replacing sound cues, and experimenting with pacing until the tone finally matched the world I wanted players to step into. I recorded narration drafts late into the night, rewriting lines that didn't feel honest and adjusting the cadence until my voice sounded like someone who believed in her own work. Throughout it all, Dr. Hayes stayed involved with deliberate consistency. Every few days, I received emails packed with annotated screenshots, short video demonstrations, or voice notes breaking down how a moment could land more effectively. He never talked down to me. Instead, he treated my project like something worth refining, not something to be rescued. His feedback sharpened my instincts. If I hesitated on a design choice, his comments nudged me toward clarity rather than self-doubt. For the first time, improving my work felt like collaboration, not a scramble to prove that what I created mattered. But even as my world expanded, the family group chat remained stuck in its usual orbit. Notifications buzzed through the day, full of excitement about Nolan's upcoming conference appearance in San Francisco. Mom kept posting photos of outfits she thought Ruby should consider, and Dad went on about how proud he was to see Nolan's firm listed as a gold sponsor. Nolan chimed in often, bragging about who he'd meet, which panels he'd attend, and what kind of press coverage the event might attract. Not once did anyone ask what I was doing or where I had been spending my time. Their indifference didn't surprise me, but it still felt like being erased in real time. When they discussed networking opportunities, Nolan finally wrote, "Avery wouldn't understand these events anyway," followed by a laughing emoji. I stared at the line until the bubble of irritation gave way to something quieter, certainty. He didn't know me well enough to realize how far from the truth that was. One afternoon, Aunt Cheryl called, her voice carrying the same gentle caution she used whenever she was about to say something uncomfortable. After a few minutes of small talk, she mentioned she'd spoken with my parents recently. She hesitated before adding that they often told relatives I was still not quite stable and trying to figure things out, as if my life was a half-formed draft instead of a choice. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She simply believed I deserved honesty. I didn't argue or explain anything. I thanked her for telling me and let the silence settle between us until we said goodbye. When the call ended, I set my phone face down and felt an unexpected calm move through me, heavy but clarifying. Their version of me had never been real to begin with. Work became an anchor after that. I refined lighting in key scenes, polished environmental textures, and reworked the playable segment so players would transition more naturally from one emotional beat to the next. In the evenings, I practiced my presentation, adjusting tone, pacing, posture, and phrasing until my explanations felt confident instead of apologetic. Rehearsing forced me to confront how much I had minimized myself over the years, and each run-through made me stand a little straighter. I wasn't preparing out of fear of failure. I was preparing because the moment finally felt worth rising to. A week before the event, a padded envelope arrived. Inside was a lanyard with speaker printed in bold across the top and my name beneath it. Holding it made everything feel unmistakably real. There was no angle my parents could twist, no comparison they could force. This was something they hadn't touched, framed, or shaped. It belonged entirely to me. That night, I laid out my suitcase and packed, deliberately checking equipment, organizing files, and choosing clothes I felt steady in. When I placed the badge on top of my neatly folded items, the moment felt like closing the door on every version of myself that had waited for approval. In a few days, I'd be on a plane to San Francisco, not as the quiet one at the table, not as the overlooked sibling, but as someone invited to speak, because she had built something worth showing. San Francisco had a kind of energy that made everything feel sharpened, like the air itself expected something from you. When I stepped out of the rideshare in front of the convention center, my stomach tightened. Not in fear, but in the way you tense before diving into deep water. The building was enormous, wrapped in bright banners and framed by crowds of people carrying badges, equipment cases, and cups of coffee that looked too small for the day ahead. Inside, the noise blended into a steady hum that almost drowned out my anxious heartbeat. I checked in, clipped on my badge, and followed the signs toward the exhibitor hall until I spotted Dr. Hayes near my assigned booth. He greeted me with a reassuring nod, then walked me through the setup with practiced ease, adjusting monitors, checking angles, and showing me how to position the lighting so the shadows in my environment design displayed the way I intended. His calm precision steadied me more than I expected, and by the time we finished my booth, felt like a small, self-contained world, one I actually belonged in. When the floor opened to attendees, people drifted toward the booth almost immediately. Some approached timidly before picking up the controller. Others dove straight in asking questions about the mechanics or inspiration behind certain scenes. Watching strangers navigate the game felt surreal. Each reaction told me more than I could have learned from weeks of debugging. One woman said the tone reminded her of a memory she hadn't thought about in years. A student asked how long it took to build the emotional pacing. A developer leaned in to study the lighting and said, "My color choices were quietly confident," a phrase that stuck with me. The steady stream of feedback wrapped around me like proof that the work I'd built alone in my apartment actually resonated with real people. Dr. Hayes stopped by, periodically offering small adjustments, but mostly, he let me stand on my own. The realization that I wasn't hiding behind anyone, least of all my family, strengthened something in me I hadn't recognized before. As the time for my panel approached, a flicker of nerves returned, but it wasn't the kind that made me want to back out. It felt more like the hum of anticipation before stepping into a moment you've spent months preparing for. Backstage, I rehearsed the opening lines under my breath, running my finger along the edge of my note cards even though I barely needed them. When the moderator called my name, I stepped onto the stage, momentarily swallowed by the brightness of the spotlight. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, I anchored myself with a deep breath and began. I talked about the game's origin, how sketches turned into scenes, scenes into chapters, and chapters into something that felt like a heartbeat. Then I shifted into the more vulnerable part, explaining that the story had grown from years of feeling unheard by the people who were supposed to see me most clearly. I didn't offer names or specifics. I simply shared the truth that creating this world had been my way of carving out a space where my voice mattered. The room stayed unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that meant people were listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. When the Q&A opened, the first questions were technical build time, engine choices, narrative structure, until someone near the front asked, "How did your family react to all this?" The question hit harder than I expected. I paused long enough for the silence to feel intentional, then answered with care. I said that not everyone grows up with support for creative work, that sometimes the people closest to you misunderstand the path you choose, and that learning to move forward anyway had shaped the game as much as any design decision. It was honest without being accusatory, and for the first time the truth didn't feel like a burden. As I spoke, the house lights dimmed just enough for the audience to come into focus, and that was when I saw them. My parents sat in the center row, Nolan beside them, Ruby by his side. The sight jolted through me like static. For a fraction of a second, instinct urged me to shrink back into the version of myself they had always expected, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace. But the moment dissolved almost as quickly as it surfaced. I held my posture, kept my tone steady, and answered the next question with the same calm I had built over weeks of preparation. Their presence didn't change the truth I had spoken, and it didn't change the fact that this stage, this moment existed because of my work, not theirs. For the first time, I finished something in full view of the people who had underestimated me, and I didn't flinch. I had barely stepped into the backstage corridor when I felt someone grab my elbow, not aggressively, but with enough urgency to signal trouble. My family was gathered in a tight cluster near the exit, and the moment I walked toward them, the air thickened almost painfully. Peter spoke first, his voice clipped and sharp, calling my presentation a public display of disrespect. He said I had made our family look divided, that professionals might now question our values. He talked as if my work were a scandal instead of the reason I was invited to speak. Before I could process his words, Marilyn leaned in with that familiar mix of disappointment and indignation, saying my speech could overshadow Nolan's career, that the finance world cared about family image, and that my little project could be misunderstood by the wrong people. Her tone made it clear she wasn't worried about me, she was worried about what I could cost them. Nolan didn't wait his turn. He scoffed under his breath and said events like this weren't what they used to be, that conferences were letting anyone in, and that the room had clapped, only because tech crowds love a sob story. It was the kind of remark he made when he felt threatened, wrapped in casual arrogance to mask the insecurity underneath. His eyes refused to meet mine, which only sharpened the sting. Something inside me, long bruised and patient, finally reached the end of its capacity. I didn't raise my voice. I simply spoke. I told them how the dinner had felt, the way every comment had chipped away at whatever dignity I had left, the way they'd treated my work like a joke, the way they'd erased me from conversations before I even entered them. I reminded them of the years of being sidelined, being labeled the uncertain child, the one still figuring things out, the one they could afford to ignore because Nolan was the one they had chosen to champion. The more I spoke, the more their expressions shifted. Peter's outrage lost its confidence. Marilyn's tightly folded arms loosened. Nolan's jaw twitched. None of them expected me to confront them like this, in full contrast to the silence they were used to. But the most striking change wasn't from them, it was from Ruby. She had been standing a step behind Nolan, watching the exchange like someone replaying a memory in real time. Her face was troubled not in judgment, but in dawning comprehension. When she finally stepped forward, her voice cut clean through the tension. She said the dinner hadn't felt like light teasing at all, that she remembered the dismissive tone, the way the table had turned cold each time I spoke, and how wrong it had felt, even though she barely knew me. Then she looked at Nolan, her eyebrows drawing tight, and asked him why he hadn't told her his sister was a developer. The question wasn't about information, it was about honesty, and the silence that followed was louder than any confession. For a moment, no one said anything. The corridor buzzed with the distant sounds of the conference footsteps, chatter, and faint applause from another room, but around us the quiet was suffocating. It wasn't thoughtful or reflective. It was the sound of people realizing that the narrative they had relied on no longer held. They had always assumed I'd stay in the margins, that my place in the family was static and safe for them to overlook. But seeing me on that stage, hearing the applause, witnessing the respect from strangers, they couldn't twist that into insignificance. Something had shifted, not just in me, but in the balance they had built their comfort on. A thought crossed my mind, sharp and steady. There comes a point when staying silent becomes its own kind of betrayal, mostly of yourself. I had been carrying that truth for years without naming it. Now I understood it fully. So I told them clearly and without hesitation that I was done trying to fit into a version of family that had no room for me. I said I wasn't interested in repairing something built on hierarchy and conditional approval. I said I hoped they would reflect, but whether they did or not wasn't my concern anymore. Their reactions barely registered Peter's stunned inhale, Marilyn's trembling attempt at a reply, Nolan's stiff posture, Ruby's conflicted glance. None of it changed what I already knew. I didn't wait for permission or closure. I turned, walked down the corridor, and stepped back into the pulse of the conference, the badge around my neck catching the light as I moved. For the first time, walking away didn't feel like losing something. It felt like reclaiming everything I had been denied. Returning to Richmond felt strangely calm, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally dissolved. My apartment looked exactly the same as when I left, small, a little cluttered, filled with remnants of half-finished ideas, but for the first time it felt like a place that belonged entirely to me. I made tea, opened my laptop, and began sorting through the final tasks for my game's release. There was no dramatic music, no triumphant rush, just a steady focus that felt cleaner and more grounded than anything I'd known before. The confrontation at the conference didn't replay in my head. I didn't analyze expressions or words. I wasn't searching for hidden warmth anymore. I was done negotiating for space in a family that never made room for me. The game launched a week later with little fanfare. I hit publish, closed the window, and went for a walk through my neighborhood. When I got back, the first few reviews were already in, small indie bloggers praising the emotional atmosphere, a mid-tier critic complimenting the design choices, a YouTube channel with a decent following, calling it a surprisingly polished indie debut. Sales picked up at a modest but steady pace. It wasn't viral success, but it was honest success. Each download, each comment, each message felt like a quiet confirmation that I hadn't been delusional for choosing this path. Soon, I started hosting weekly live streams and posting devlogs, and a small but passionate community formed around the game. They asked about mechanics, lore details, creative decisions, things no one in my family had ever bothered to ask. For the first time, people interacted with me not as an afterthought or a comparison point, but as an individual whose work had value. The absence of condescension was almost startling. My family's messages began arriving slowly. Marilyn sent a long text about wanting to clear the air. Peter followed with an invitation to dinner framed as an opportunity to talk things out. Then came a group message insisting they wanted to explain their side, yet none of them acknowledged the years of dismissal, the favoritism, or the hallway confrontation. They wanted restoration, not understanding. I didn't respond. Silence wasn't revenge. It was a decision to stop setting myself on fire just to keep their comfort warm. Aunt Cheryl reached out differently. Her message was short and sincere. She respected whatever I chose, and she hoped the distance gave me peace. She didn't try to soften what had happened or defend anyone's behavior. This was the honesty I had needed when I was younger, and although it arrived late, it felt real. While I moved forward, subtle consequences began surfacing around Nolan. A coworker joked during a team meeting about the talented Collins sibling, and someone else asked why he'd never mentioned having a developer in the family. It wasn't malicious teasing, just the kind that stings because it exposes something true. Ruby grew distant from him, disturbed by what she'd witnessed at the dinner and in the hallway. She messaged me once, briefly apologizing for how blind she'd been to the dynamic. I thanked her but kept the boundary firm. Marilyn and Peter seemed increasingly unsettled by the distance. They sent updates about home repairs, pictures of their garden, random notes about things I used to like, as if appealing to nostalgia might pull me back. Yet none of their messages carried the humility needed for genuine repair. They were trying to rebuild the bridge without acknowledging the fire they had set to it. Meanwhile, my life kept expanding. I signed with a small indie collaborative, began mentoring newer developers, and started sketching ideas for my next project. The rhythm of my days felt stable, intentional, and finally unburdened by the need to prove anything. People sometimes asked whether I wanted reconciliation, but the answer stayed simple. You can care about people without giving them access to hurt you again. My distance wasn't dramatic or vindictive. It was a boundary informed by clarity and self-respect. I didn't hate my family. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't hoping for an apology or bracing for another wound. I had simply stopped participating in a dynamic that had never seen me fully. And in that stillness, something softened, not toward them, but toward myself. My life wasn't louder without them, but it was cleaner and in its own quiet way, far more free. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.